Here's your new Script 1 flowing paragraph to 5,876 words. The first time German General Erwin Rommel saw an American Jeep up close, it was not on a battlefield. It was sitting abandoned in the North African sand, its engine still warm, its canvas top-dusted with the fine ochre grit of the Sahara, and he walked around it slowly, the way a man walks around something that unsettles him, not because it was fearsome in the traditional sense, not because it carried heavy armor or mounted a devastating cannon, but because it was so impossibly simple, so stripped of everything unnecessary, so purely and ruthlessly functional, that it made the elaborate German engineering philosophy seem almost vain by comparison. And he is said to have remarked to his staff that if he could have had a division of these vehicles 6 months earlier, the whole campaign might have gone differently. And though history does not always preserve the exact words of generals standing in the desert beside captured equipment, the sentiment was real and widely shared among the Wehrmacht's senior officers, because the Jeep that squat, ugly, four-wheeled, open-topped machine that America mass-produced by the hundreds of thousands was by the end of the Second World War considered by enemies and allies alike to be not merely a useful vehicle, but the single most consequential piece of military hardware the conflict produced. A judgment that surprises people today because we tend to associate decisive weapons with firepower and destruction, with the Sherman tank or the B-17 bomber or the atomic bomb. Yet the generals who actually fought the war, German generals who spent years trying to defeat the Allied war machine, who studied its strengths and catalogued its advantages with the cold professional eye of men whose lives depended on accurate assessment, consistently pointed to the Jeep as the weapon that changed everything. And to understand why, you have to go back to the beginning, back to the late 1930s, when the United States Army issued one of the most important procurement requests in military history, a document so deceptively modest in its language that it barely hinted at the revolution it would produce, asking American manufacturers to design a lightweight, general-purpose reconnaissance vehicle that could carry 4 men, travel across any terrain, be maintained by a mechanic with basic tools, be light enough to be lifted by hand, and be produced in enormous quantities at low cost. And the request was so demanding in its combination of requirements, light but strong, fast but rugged, simple but versatile, that most engineers who read it assumed it was impossible, because military vehicles at the time were either fast or tough, either light or capable, never all of these things at once. And the Army gave manufacturers just 49 days to submit a working prototype, a timeline so aggressive it bordered on absurd. And yet, out of this pressure, out of this combination of impossible demands and impossibly tight deadlines, came the Willys MB and the Ford GPW, the 2 variants that would be standardized and produced in such staggering numbers, over 640,000 units by the war's end, that the Jeep became the circulatory system of the entire Allied war effort. The vehicle through which every other advantage the Allies possessed was translated into action on the ground. And the German generals understood this with a clarity that sometimes escapes modern historians who focus on tanks and aircraft and naval battles, because those weapons were visible and dramatic, while the Jeep worked invisibly, doing the unglamorous work of moving officers to the front and radio operators to observation posts and ammunition to forward positions and wounded men to aid stations, doing this work not on good roads but on no roads at all, across fields and through streams and up hillsides that would swallow a conventional vehicle. And this capacity for universal movement was not merely a convenience, it was a strategic transformation of the first order. Because war in the industrial age had always been constrained by the question of where vehicles could go, with armies historically tied to roads and railways and navigable rivers, their freedom of movement limited by the infrastructure of the landscape, and the Jeep broke this constraint so completely that it forced German commanders to rethink their entire defensive doctrine, because you could no longer assume that a slope was impassable, or a stream bed was an obstacle, or a muddy field was a barrier, because the Jeep would simply go, and it would go carrying the people and equipment needed to exploit whatever opportunity had just opened up. And General Alfred Jodl, who served as chief of the operations staff of the German High Command and was one of the most analytically rigorous minds in the Wehrmacht, stated after the war during Allied debriefings, that the mobility advantage conferred by American motorization and by the Jeep specifically was the single factor the German army was never able to adequately counter, not because Germany lacked engineering talent or industrial capacity in the early years of the war, but because the German military philosophy prioritized specialized excellence over universal utility, producing vehicles that were superb at specific tasks and mediocre at everything else, while the Jeep was merely good at everything and available everywhere, and availability, as every logistics officer in history has understood, is ultimately more valuable than perfection, and this distinction between German and American engineering philosophy is crucial to understanding why the Jeep mattered as much as it did, because German military engineering in the Second World War was in many ways more sophisticated than American engineering, producing tanks with more powerful guns, aircraft with more advanced engines, and specialized vehicles of extraordinary capability. But this sophistication came at a cost that the German war machine could not ultimately sustain, because sophisticated machines require sophisticated maintenance, specialized parts, trained mechanics, and stable supply chains. And the Eastern Front, the North African desert, the Italian mountains, and the Norman hedgerows were none of these things. They were environments that destroyed complexity, that ground down precision engineering with mud and sand and cold and the chaos of constant combat. And the Jeep thrived in exactly these conditions, because it had been designed from the beginning with the assumption that it would be maintained by tired men with limited tools in terrible conditions. And so its engine was simple enough that a soldier with a basic mechanical aptitude could diagnose and fix most problems in the field. Its parts were standardized across hundreds of thousands of identical vehicles, so that a Jeep stripped for parts outside Tobruk could donate its carburetor to a Jeep breaking down outside Cherbourg. And its construction was robust enough to absorb the kind of punishment that would have destroyed a more refined machine. And German General Hans von Luck, one of Rommel's most capable subordinates, who fought in Poland, France, North Africa, and Normandy, wrote in his memoirs that observing American motorized units moving through the French countryside in 1944 was a revelation and a reckoning simultaneously, because the speed at which American commanders could shift forces, redirect attacks, exploit breakthroughs, and reinforce threatened positions was simply beyond anything the German army could match, with its mixture of horse-drawn transport, heavy tracked vehicles, and limited fuel supplies. And the Jeep was the critical element in this speed, because it was the vehicle of command, the machine that carried the officers who made decisions, and got those decisions implemented before the situation changed. And in modern warfare, the speed of decision-making is often more important than the weight of firepower, because a commander who can react in 1 hour will consistently defeat a commander who reacts in 4 hours, even if the slower commander has more guns. And the Jeep gave American officers a reaction speed that German commanders found deeply unsettling and ultimately impossible to counter. And to appreciate the full weight of this advantage, you have to understand what command and control looked like before the Jeep, in the First World War, and even in the early years of the Second, where generals and their staffs were often separated from the action by hours of difficult travel, where a commander who wanted to see the front for himself faced a journey of considerable time and effort, where the gap between decision and execution was measured not in minutes, but in hours and sometimes days. And the Jeep collapsed this gap to almost nothing, because a general could climb into a Jeep at his headquarters and be at the forward observation post in 20 minutes regardless of whether there was a road. And this proximity of command to action changed the character of American military operations in ways that compounded every other American advantage, because better-informed commanders made better decisions, and faster decisions allowed smaller opportunities to be exploited before they closed. And this is why Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West during the Normandy campaign and one of the most experienced soldiers in the German army, reportedly said after the war that what defeated Germany and France was not the weight of Allied bombing or the number of Allied tanks, but the astonishing flexibility of Allied ground forces, the way they seemed to be everywhere at once, the way a breakthrough that should have taken days to exploit was exploited in hours. And this flexibility was not accidental or mystical, It was mechanical. It was the Jeep multiplied by hundreds of thousands across every front and theater, threading the Allied war, machined together into something that moved faster and reacted quicker than anything the German military doctrine had prepared for. And it is worth pausing here to consider the numbers, because they tell a story that statistics rarely tell so clearly. Because between 1941 and 1945 American factories produced approximately 647,000 Jeeps, a figure so large it strains comprehension. And to put it in context, Germany produced roughly 50,000 of its own light utility vehicles during the same period, and even accounting for the difference in overall industrial capacity between the two nations, the disparity in this specific category of vehicle was so extreme that it represented a qualitative shift in operational capability rather than merely a quantitative advantage. Because having 10 times as many command and liaison vehicles does not simply mean you can do the same things 10 times as fast. It means you can do things that simply cannot be done at all with fewer vehicles. You can maintain simultaneous communication and physical presence across a front of such width and depth that the enemy cannot identify your main effort until it is too late to respond. And this is precisely what happened in Operation Cobra in July 1944, when General Omar Bradley's forces broke through the German lines at Saint-Lô and Patton's Third Army flooded through the gap, moving so fast across the French countryside that German commanders were still drawing defensive lines on maps that American Jeeps had already passed through, and Patton himself was a Jeep commander in the most literal sense, moving constantly across his sector, appearing at division headquarters, forward command posts, supply depots, and field hospitals with a speed and unpredictability that kept his subordinates alert and his enemies confused. And his famous remark that a pint of sweat saves a gallon of blood was not just a motivational slogan, but an operational philosophy enabled by the Jeep, because the sweat in question was his own, spent in constant movement across the battlefield, rather than sitting at a headquarters waiting for reports to arrive. And the reports that did arrive in German headquarters describing American command methods were consistently alarming to officers trained in a system where generals were expected to command from prepared positions rather than from the front seat of an open vehicle bouncing across a field. And there is a broader point here about the relationship between technology and military culture that the Jeep illustrates better than almost any other weapon of the Second World War, because the Jeep did not simply give American commanders a new vehicle, it gave them a new way of thinking about command, a new relationship with the battlefield that was more direct and more physical and more immediate than anything the pre-war military tradition had sanctioned. And this cultural transformation was as important as the mechanical one, and German commanders who studied American operations after the war often identified this willingness to be physically present, to see with their own eyes, rather than relying on reports filtered through layers of staff, as one of the defining characteristics of effective American generalship in the later years of the war. And the Jeep made it possible, not because a general could not theoretically travel to the front by other means, but because the Jeep made such travel so fast and so reliable and so independent of roads and infrastructure that it removed the practical friction that had always discouraged commanders from venturing forward too often. And beyond its role in command and control, the Jeep performed dozens of other functions with equal reliability, serving as an ambulance capable of carrying 2 stretchers across terrain that would destroy a wheeled ambulance of conventional design, serving as a mobile radio platform that could establish communications from any hilltop or field, serving as a weapons carrier mounting machine guns or recoilless rifles that could provide fire support in situations where heavier vehicles could not reach, serving as a prime mover for light artillery pieces that needed to keep up with fast-moving infantry, serving as a courier vehicle threading through traffic and terrain to deliver orders and intelligence with a reliability that telephone lines and radio sets could not always match, and perhaps most remarkably, serving as an improvised everything, a generator platform, a water carrier, a command post on wheels, a weapons maintenance bench, a field kitchen support vehicle, a bridge reconnaissance tool, because its simplicity and its ubiquity meant that soldiers felt free to improvise with it in ways they would never improvise with more complex or more scarce equipment. And this culture of improvisation around the Jeep was itself a form of military advantage, because armies that can improvise effectively respond better to unexpected situations than armies that require standardized solutions to every problem. And the Second World War was overwhelmingly a war of unexpected situations, of plans that lasted until contact with the enemy and then required immediate revision, of opportunities that appeared without warning and closed just as quickly. And the Jeep was the perfect tool for an army learning to think on its feet, because it was itself the ultimate improvised solution, a vehicle designed by committee under impossible time pressure that somehow transcended its chaotic origins to become exactly what the war required. And German engineers who examined captured Jeeps were consistently struck by what they described as the brutal honesty of the design, by which they meant that every component did exactly what it needed to do, and nothing more. That there was no elegance for its own sake, no refinement beyond necessity, no engineering pride expressed in complexity, and this was the opposite of the German engineering tradition, which valued technical sophistication as an end in itself, and produced magnificent machines that were sometimes too magnificent for the conditions they had to operate in. And the Tiger tank is the perfect counterpoint to the Jeep in this regard, because the Tiger was an engineering masterpiece, heavily armored, powerfully armed, formidable in direct combat, yet it broke down constantly, was nearly impossible to transport by rail without removing its wide combat tracks and replacing them with narrower transport tracks, required enormous quantities of fuel it could rarely obtain, and needed maintenance hours that simply were not available in a fighting retreat, and a single Tiger disabled by a mechanical failure blocked roads and consumed recovery resources and delayed movements in ways that a broken-down Jeep never could, because a Jeep could be pushed to the roadside by 2 men, cannibalized for parts in 20 minutes, or abandoned without significant loss to the overall operation. And this asymmetry, the Tiger's high value making every breakdown a crisis, and the Jeep's low value making every breakdown irrelevant, captures something fundamental about the difference between German and American approaches to military materiel in the Second World War. And it is an asymmetry that German commanders understood and lamented because they could see that the American approach was winning, even when individual German weapons were superior in direct confrontation. And General Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored doctrine, and arguably the most important military theorist Germany produced in the 20th century, wrote after the war that the Allied ability to sustain operations through the consistent availability of reliable, simple, maintainable equipment was the decisive logistical advantage of the conflict, and that Germany's pursuit of technical supremacy in individual weapons came at the cost of the operational sustainability that ultimately determined the outcome of campaigns rather than individual battles. And the Jeep was his primary example, not because it was the most powerful vehicle on the battlefield, but because it was the most present, and presence over time is what wins wars rather than power in moments. And this is a lesson that military planners have had to relearn in every generation, because the temptation of sophisticated weaponry is always powerful, and the value of reliable simplicity is always underestimated until the sophisticated weapon fails in the mud, and the simple weapon keeps running. And the North African campaign illustrates this point with particular clarity because the desert environment was one of the most destructive in the world for mechanical equipment, with fine sand infiltrating every bearing and seal and filter, with temperature extremes that cracked rubber and warped metal, with the complete absence of infrastructure meaning that every spare part had to be carried or captured. And in this environment, the Jeep's simplicity was not merely convenient but existential, because vehicles that could not be maintained in the field were not vehicles at all but immobile obstacles, and Rommel's Afrika Korps was equipped with vehicles that were, in many respects, superior to their British and American counterparts in direct performance, but which required maintenance infrastructure that the desert could not support. While the Jeep could be kept running by a corporal with a toolbox and a manual, and this difference compounded over months of desert campaigning until the German logistical situation became the primary constraint on German operational ambitions, not Allied firepower, not Allied maneuver, But the simple inability to keep enough German vehicles running to sustain the pace of operations that Rommel's genius demanded, and the same dynamic played out on the Eastern Front where the vast distances, the primitive roads, and the catastrophic winters of 1941 and 1942 destroyed German vehicle fleets with a thoroughness that no Allied army could have matched, while the jeeps supplied to Soviet forces under Lend-Lease kept running through conditions that left German transport columns frozen solid by the roadside. And Soviet commanders praised the jeep with an enthusiasm that matched their German counterparts from the opposite direction, because where the Germans admired it reluctantly, acknowledging the advantage it gave their enemies, the Soviets embraced it gratefully, recognizing in it the difference between an army that could keep moving and an army that could not. And the Lend-Lease program as a whole transferred over 51,000 jeeps to the Soviet Union. And Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the greatest Soviet commander of the war, stated in his post-war memoirs that of all the American equipment supplied to the Soviet Union, the Jeep and the Studebaker truck were the most important to Soviet military success. A remarkable statement from a man who commanded more tanks than any general in history, and who had at his disposal the full industrial output of the Soviet state, yet who singled out an American light utility vehicle as among the most decisive contributions to victory. And what Zhukov understood, and what the German generals understood from the other side, was that the Jeep was not a weapon in the conventional sense, but a force multiplier, a machine that made every other part of the army more effective by ensuring that the people and information and supplies needed to sustain combat operations could get where they were needed when they were needed, regardless of what the path, terrain, or the weather, or the enemy chose to do about it. And this force multiplication effect is extraordinarily difficult to quantify, precisely because it appears in the absence of failures, rather than in the presence of successes. It shows up as the supply convoy that arrived on time, the officer who reached the critical crossroads before the enemy did, the wounded man who made it to the aid station while he was still savable, the radio operator who established communications from the hilltop that nobody thought a vehicle could reach. And none of these events make it into the battle narratives because they are the background hum of operational success rather than its dramatic foreground. Yet, taken together across 6 years of global war, they represent an advantage so pervasive and so consistent that the generals who experienced it directly had no hesitation in calling the Jeep the war's most important weapon. And it is perhaps fitting that this most important weapon was also the most democratic, the most thoroughly American in its design philosophy, because it embodied the American instinct for practical problem-solving over theoretical elegance, for mass availability over elite capability, for the solution that works reliably over the solution that works brilliantly and occasionally, and this democratic character extended to the way it was used, because the Jeep belonged to everyone, to generals and to privates, to combat troops and to support units, to the front line and the rear area. And this universality meant that the advantage it provided was not concentrated in elite formations, but distributed across the entire force, raising the performance of every unit that had access to it, rather than creating a small number of exceptional units while the rest struggled. And the German experience was the opposite. With elite panzer divisions equipped with formidable machines, while ordinary infantry divisions relied on horse-drawn transport that would not have looked out of place in 1914. And this uneven distribution of capability meant that German forces had peaks of effectiveness, but also valleys of weakness that Allied commanders learned to identify and exploit. And the American force, with its universal motorization and its ubiquitous jeeps, had no such valleys, or at least far fewer of them, and the cumulative effect of this difference, measured across thousands of engagements over years of fighting, was the margin of victory. And when the German generals sat in Allied detention camps in 1945 and 1946, being interviewed by military historians who wanted to understand what had gone wrong, what had turned the Wehrmacht from the most formidable fighting force in the world into a defeated army, many of them returned again and again to questions of logistics and mobility, to the gap between German and American motorization, and to the Jeep as the most visible symbol of that gap. Not because it was glamorous or fearsome, but because it was everywhere, always, reliably, in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment, and that quality of being everywhere always is the rarest and most valuable quality in warfare, more valuable than the heaviest armor or the most powerful gun, and the United States Army understood this intuitively in 1940 when it issued that modest, demanding, seemingly impossible procurement request, and the engineers who responded to it in 49 days understood it. And the factories that built 647,000 of them understood it. And in the end, the German generals who spent the war trying to defeat the machine that the Jeep kept running understood it too. And their verdict, offered in the ruins of the world they had tried to conquer, was unambiguous. The Jeep was not just a vehicle, it was the weapon that won the war. The weapon that proved once and finally that in the long contest between brilliance and reliability, between the perfect weapon and the weapon that is simply always there, it is the weapon that is always there that changes history.